It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. A new, closer relationship for Britain and the EU. What will it mean for both sides?
That is what today is all about, moving on from stale old debates, looking forward, not backwards, focusing on what we can do together.
Indeed, this is a big day because we are now turning the page and opening a new chapter.
There are new agreements on defence and food standards, but has it come at the expense of the UK fishing industry? We speak to the boss of the national fishing body. Joining me today, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride, journalist and broadcaster Sonia Soda, and the former Conservative advisor Anita Boateng. This is Politics Live. So, a deal has been done between the UK and the EU. Relations are being reset, says the government, and closer ties forged. Well, we certainly saw warm greetings for the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, as she and Antonio Costa, President of the European Council, arrived at the Grand Mansion, as you can see here, of Lancaster House for the UK-EU summit. There's been a huge build-up to this summit today. There they are, going towards Keir Starmer, and they had introductory remarks earlier today ahead of a press conference that is about to start in the next 15 minutes or so, when we will get more of the substance and the detail of these deals as part of this deepening of relations between the two. This morning, though, we woke up to a different sort of tone and mood, reminiscent of Brexit rows over negotiations in the past. Have a look at this in the Daily Mail. The Prime Minister risks Brexit vote betrayal. This was the headline in The Guardian. Talks on reset of UK-EU relations go down to the wire before summit. 'Twas ever thus. Then we had the Daily Telegraph. Labour revolt over Brexit betrayal. And the I paper. Cheaper food and boost to trade as UK agrees to follow EU rules in today's big Brexit reset. And finally, The Times. EU's fishing demands pose late threat to deal. My opening question, starting with you, Stella, and then Mel, is this a return to the Brexit wars?
I certainly hope not, because I think the British public can see very clearly now the damage that the Brexit that we had negotiated has done. They've seen the increase in the cost of food. They've seen the businesses who've just given up because there's so much paperwork. They've seen the risk that it presents to our status on the international stage, and particularly when it comes to things like working together to tackle the impact of Putin and energy costs. None of us want to go back to the division of the referendum. I sit here, chair of the Labour Movement for Europe. I'm not here sitting calling for rejoin. I wanted us to have a salvage operation. It looks to me like for the 16,000 businesses who've just given up trading, there's going to be a lot in here to welcome, particularly that reduction in paperwork.
Mel, is it a return to the Brexit wars? We have seen there and heard from colleagues of yours the sort of language that was reminiscent of those years post-2016, surrender, betrayal.
So nobody wants to see division. That's absolutely the case. And as with Stella, we both sort of went through that period in Parliament. It was deeply...
We're triggered.
Deeply difficult. But look, the question is this a good deal? And does it respect the fact that we voted ultimately to leave the European Union? I think on things like dynamic alignment and taking rules from Brussels and maybe paying money to Brussels, we're yet to see, and the deal on fish, I'm not convinced at this stage of the day, and we'll find out a bit more in a moment, that deal does respect the result of the referendum in that way. And I think that could be problematic.
All right, well, let's have a look at this tweet from the Prime Minister. 3 deals. He's referring to the deals with the US and India, and now this one today with the EU. Within 2 weeks, I've rolled up my sleeves to deliver for British people, British jobs and British businesses. We're putting money back in your pocket. To you, Sonia, could this deal change the political fortunes for Keir Starmer?
Well, I think the Labour Party, the number one thing it has to deliver in order to change its political fortunes is growth. The next election will be mostly about the economy and whether people are feeling better off. And for me, this language of betrayal, surrender, it is childish hyperbole. We've got a growth issue in this country. We've seen growth lag for the last 20 years. We've seen living standards stagnate. We need economic growth. Trade deals with your closest neighbours are one way to deliver that growth. And the idea that you're not going to make a trade agreement and there be compromises on both sides, it's completely childish and it's lying to the British public. And I think the British public have had enough lies from people like the Conservative Party who say, oh, we can leave the EU and we can have it all and we won't be economically worse off. We are worse off as a result. We need to make some compromises. That's what the government's doing. And quite frankly, I think the public are going to be OK with that.
Well, you were once a Conservative advisor, Anita. What do you make of what Sonia has said? How much could this reset change the political weather for Keir Starmer?
I think not in a positive direction, to be perfectly honest, because the question is, first of all, I think Mel asked the right question, is this a good deal? And from what I can see, and I'm not someone who has ever used the phrase Brexit betrayal and looks very cynically at these kinds of things and thinks in negotiation it is give and take, but the benefit seems to be the sanitary and phytosanitary deal, which, I mean, I was looking at Best for Britain, who are a big kind of pro-EU think tank.
And these
even
are standards
they
on
have
food
said,
and agricultural
exactly.
products.
And even they worked with Frontier Economics and said an SPS deal will have no statistically significant benefit to trade. So the question of, is this going to deliver growth? I'm not so sure. And then when you look at those elephant traps of the fishing deal and the fact that areas like Grimsby, for instance, could be negatively impacted by this, and then you consider, and we don't know the detail of that mobility scheme, you have two areas where I think Labour are increasingly vulnerable.
Well, we'll come back to this discussion a little later in the programme. As I say, we've got a press conference with the three leaders we saw earlier in the programme coming up in about 10 minutes' time. Let's talk to Vicky Young, the BBC's deputy political editor. She's outside Lancaster House. Hello to you. Vicky, the UK chose to leave the EU in 2016. A deal was finalised after many years of division and argument in 2019 under Boris Johnson. Keir Starmer's made a calculation that closer ties to the EU will make people here better off. How much of a political gamble is that?
Well, that is exactly how he is trying to frame it, because he will be well aware that he will be accused of Brexit betrayal, of going back on what the people wanted. And he, of course, one of the leading figures in the Labour Party who was fighting that and calling for a second referendum. So he knows very well what he will be accused of. So the way they are framing this in their language is to keep talking about practical, common sense solutions, saying to people that they are our closest trading partners. We do far more trading with them than we do with the US, for example. So we have to make that work better. And that's what this is about. So he's saying practical things, such as being allowed to sell more burgers and sausages into the EU. It also then helps, of course, with the relationship between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, all those checks which were causing such anxiety there, they would then go. But of course, the flip side is we will then have to be following rules that we have had nothing to do with setting. He's also talking about defence contracts. The UK will have access to those lucrative defence contracts as the EU tries to really up its spending on defence. All these things, he says, will be good for growth. Now, the figure they're giving is £9 billion for the UK economy by 2040, so a long way off. But he will try and frame this as him just being practical, just making things that are common sense and putting more money in people's pockets here.
It is about trade-offs and compromises in any negotiation, and no doubt both sides will want to claim that they have had a win in terms of the negotiations. But what about other areas like a youth mobility scheme for under 30-year-olds, and whether or not that nods to any freedom of movement in some people's minds? And also the fishing industry. Have they been the ones that have to compromise in this deal?
Yeah, I mean, this idea now that there will be 12-year more of access to UK waters for EU fishing fleets, you know, rolling over the access they already have, but for 12 years. I mean, that is far longer than most people thought, and our understanding is that that was one of the sticking points, and the UK at the end gave away more than people were expecting. Now, we've had some from the fishing industry saying this is terrible for them, but on the other side, as ever, you know, it does help some of the fishing industry. For example, Scottish salmon, they say it's much better for them. They can sell more into the EU market. Shellfish has been a huge problem with that, selling that into the EU market, so they could benefit from that. The Youth Mobility Scheme, well, I don't think it will be called that. I think it's going to be called something different. Again, this raises that prospect that this is freedom of movement. The government are pains to say that it will be capped in terms of numbers and it will be time limited. Now, we don't have the details of that yet. These negotiations are going to carry on. This is really just the beginning, even though they've been talking already for 6 months. All sounds familiar, eh?
Yeah, it does indeed. Vicky Young, thank you very much. We'll let you go inside for the press conference that we're expecting to start in the next 5 minutes or so, around 12:30. But we'll carry on the discussion here in the studio. First of all, Mel Stride, if it's good for the economy, if trade barriers are removed, which is something you're presumably in favour of, then you can get behind this deal.
Yeah, look, things that drive growth are, all else being equal, good. 9 billion in 2040, I've just worked out, it's about 0.3% of the size of the economy, so it's very small and we're going to have to wait a long time for it.
But is it still worth doing?
But the root of the problem, to Sonia's point about growth, is growth has not been held back by a lack of these various deals. Growth has been anemic and all the forecasts have been scaled down.
Are you saying none of the trade barriers that were erected...
They do have an impact, and I've touched on that. But it is the decisions of this government on tax, on spending, on talking the economy down, on employment legislation coming through, which is a drag on growth. And what you're seeing here, if I could finish that,
sure.
what you're seeing here is 3 bad deals that have been scrabbled together very quickly. So you've got the US deal in which we're now paying more on our tariffs selling into the US market than was the case back in March, whereas the US tariffs have been reduced. You see India, where on national insurance we're absolving their workers working over here from paying it at the same time as the government jacked it all up. And on this deal with fisheries, you're seeing them the government trumpeting a deal which they had no alternative than to deliver, with the French stepping in at the last minute and getting our fishing sector right over a barrel.
Sonia?
That's the problem.
We've had anemic growth and stagnant living standards in this country since 2008.
But the OBR halved the growth rate.
Since the financial
Under
crisis.
your watch.
I don't represent the Labour Party.
All right, fair enough. Under Labour's
but we have had these anemic growth rates for the last 20 years. You can't blame that on 10 months of a Labour government. Your Conservative government has got a lot to answer for on that. When it comes to trade barriers, when you've got stagnant growth, and that was basically down to 2 low levels of business investment in this country over the last 30 to 40 years compared to some of our neighbours, the very last thing you do is erect trade barriers that have a big impact on exporting businesses. That's exactly what Boris Johnson decided to do by going for a very hard Brexit. That has had an impact on growth. It's not the only reason for low growth, but it is certainly true that growth, we'd be doing better growth, we'd be doing better on exports if we had not erected these trading barriers.
But equally, it's not fair to say that slow growth is not the fault of this government. The IMF, the World Bank, the OBR, they're all down there.
It's not a 10-month problem now. It's a 20-year problem.
Let's move back to this being a good deal or not.
Well, I mean, fundamentally,
economy,
on the
anyway.
question of business investment, one thing you don't do is make it harder by increasing the amount of money that businesses have to spend to employ people. And that, I think, has had a chilling effect on growth and will continue to do so. On the question of the deal, we've talked about some of the political traps, right? I think there are some real dangers to this mobility scheme, not just what you call it and whether there's a cap or not, but it will materially impact the immigration numbers.
Well, of course, the government has said, Anita, that it won't. I mean, they don't know, of course, at this point in time, but they do say that it's capped, it's time limited, you can't bring dependents and so on and so forth. But clearly there's been a discussion with the Home Office over this.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that really, if the government can't show that it's responding to some of that anxiety about immigration, I think it will continue to be an issue. And if you can't tackle, for instance, boats, etc., then you are in a situation where you continue to say, by the way, this is not going to matter. And the British people keep saying, we care about this. And that is the problem that Labour has gotten itself into.
Stella, would you have liked to go further, by the way?
I just think let's talk about some cold hard facts about this, Mel, because under the deal that your government negotiated, exports plummeted by 1/3 to Europe. Right now, we sell more to Europe than we do combined India, America, Indo-Pacific. You can fight many things in life, Mel. You can't fight geography. It really matters for British businesses to start reducing those barriers, including the whacking charges that your government introduced on the border to get things across the border. The amount of paperwork. Go down to Sevington. I think you will apologise to everybody who works in the logistics industry in this country. If this deal reduces or indeed eliminates the export health certificates, the paperwork that people have gone, that can only be good for growth.
Well,
let's talk about youth mobility.
Well, hang on. Let Mel come back on that, because I want to also refer to this. I think it was from 2022, when you yourself admitted Brexit created frictions in trade, says Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride. So you must welcome frictionless, certainly.
No, the one doesn't necessarily follow from the other. And to Stella's point, the fact of the matter is dynamic alignment in this arrangement, which means rule-taking from Brussels without incidentally having a seat at the table to make the rules. Hold on. Does mean that when it comes to free trade agreements with other parts of the world, and we did the deal with the CPTPP, a very fast-growing area market, it makes it much, much harder if your hands are tied by having to follow EU rules. That was part of the rationale of stepping back from it.
Your government's obsession with being friend of Europe meant you didn't even want to know if there was foot and mouth in France. You didn't even want to be part of the biosecurity alert.
Well, let him finish his point and I'll come back to you.
Finish my point. Nobody is saying that we shouldn't be reducing frictions in trade. Of course we should. We should do that with.
And do you admit that will happen?
To have ended up, as it appears to be the case, as a rule taker, subject to the European Court, the ECJ, etc., to end up as a rule taker is not going to help us.
Well, we're going to get the detail on that, but
in parts of the world that are growing faster than Europe.
You signed up to the ECJ as well. After all, it's the ECJ that the panel looking at the thing about sand deals adhered to.
It will make it harder to do deals.
So you were already part of this. This is all for the birds. Mel, the point is it going to make it easier for British businesses to trade because we're reducing the paperwork? Are you really telling me that a small deal with South Korea, which we've kept about pork markets, which I believe your previous Prime Minister Liz Truss thought was going to somehow resolve the billions of extra pounds that British businesses have had to pay in paperwork, the fact that 16,000 businesses have given up trading altogether? Are you really saying they are a price worth
the parts of the world that are really expanding and the markets that we want to get a slice of?
You want to fight geography. Can we talk about youth mobility?
Hang on.
In the global world, you can trade all around the world, and the CPTPP deal was part of that. We did 73 different free trade agreements, and what drives that is the ability to do deals where you have control.
Hang on.
I've listened to him at length.
No, because I'm going to interject here on the issue of dynamic alignment, because it probably doesn't mean an awful lot to some of our viewers, and that is this idea that if rules are changed in the future, because we're not part of the EU and we chose to leave the European Union, we will not have a say in those changes, and rules could be made that could disadvantage us. Do you accept that that was a trade-off? It was a trade-off and a compromise.
That is not what we're talking about with dynamic alignment. And this is the previous government wanted to rip up every single regulation.
Now,
I'm sorry, because this is a.
No, but Stella, that's not the question I'm asking.
I
want you to answer the question about the trade-offs. Now, we've heard about removing trade barriers, and Mel Stride's had to answer that. And I want you to answer the trade-off is that we will not be at the table when they change the rules.
Because I know that the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill is going through Parliament, which is the foundation of all of this, which is not about the same as alignment. You're talking about dynamic alignment, which is about a default, isn't it? And frankly, the previous government wants us to have separate regulations about aeroplanes, as if the idea that a plane taking off in London would have to follow different rules to a plane taking off in Berlin and landing in vice versa. The previous government tried to do separate regulatory regimes and in the end gave up and said that if we'd followed European regulations, UK regulations were set. The reality about this is businesses want to be able to trade. That means they follow common rule books. It makes common sense to people. That doesn't mean that we won't be able to vary if it's in the national interest. That's why this is a good deal.
All right. Well, let me bring the others in. We'll come to the youth mobility scheme in a bit when we've got some of the detail. And I should just say we're waiting for the press conference to start. We've seen members of the Cabinet go in. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, and David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary. They were there for those introductory remarks. They're all seated and waiting for Keir Starmer, Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen to walk in. What do you say about the rule-taking and sovereignty? Does that argument still hold in the way it did, certainly, in the wake of the referendum?
Yeah, I think there's two questions here, which is like, what is the political salience of the question of dynamic alignment? And I think you're right that in some ways the Brexit wars, many of us still have the scars on our backs from that really heated debate about sovereignty. But there is a secondary question, which is much more important, I think, than the kind of the politics of how this is going to play out, for instance, with reform, which is like, does this actually benefit the UK? Because if the dynamic alignment is a cumulative impact, right? You are slowly moving in a particular direction. And it's not just going to be about sanitary and phytosanitary, so agri-foods checks. It will, if it works, go to expand to different areas. So energy, for instance, could be another area of alignment. So the question becomes, are British people going to see benefit from not being able to diverge in some of these areas? And practically speaking, Stella, you do have to concede that that is the purpose of alignment. The purpose of these rules is to ensure that the UK is heaving more closely
Anita,
to EU rules.
You're acting as if the price of doing business is to somehow pay more, when actually it's the reverse is true. What we've seen because of Brexit is more paperwork, more cost, more non-tariff barriers. What you're talking about, when we talk about dynamic regulation, we're talking about a shared set of rules. British business has spoken. British business did not want the separate charter mark regime that the previous government tried to bring in. So the last government had to row back from this madness. It's about time we had some common sense about this.
But it's also about time that you're honest about that.
Well, I'm being honest.
Let her respond.
Well, obviously, the point is, a decision has been made by this government to say, we are going to call it shared, call it follow. The reality is EU rules will be UK rules. And there are positives to that, I'm sure, and the government can sell them if it admits it. But there won't be positives if the government pretends this isn't the reality.
Right, Sonia,
and the implications.
But are the benefits that have been raised, if they come, will be in cheaper bills? If food is perhaps cheaper in the supermarkets, if that happens, then there will be a boost to Keir Starmer. But we don't know, do we? Well, all right, hang on. Yes.
She was addressed to me. So, look, there are, of course, trade-offs, right? We live in a global world. We want to trade with other nations. There are trade-offs with sovereignty and being able to do exactly what you want in every single of your own markets. The whole point of dynamic alignment means it reduces that bureaucracy around trading, because if you are going along with the EU's regulatory standards, it makes trade much more flexible and fluid and dynamic. So it's a trade-off for us. Yes, we can say we're not doing your thing, we're not going to follow you. In fact, that's what the last government did. We didn't really make any use of that.
Well, I was just about to say, why didn't you diverge more? Why didn't you diverge more if it was such a big thing?
But let's just be honest about those trade-offs. And Stella is right. There are lots of businesses who want this. And I didn't see any democratic sort of demand from the public to say, well, actually, we want to be poorer by not following the EU standards. When have we had that conversation?
Well, Mel, what about the divergence? Why didn't you make more of that?
Well, look, the reality is we've gone through a period of our political history. We've ended up where we are now, and that's what matters. And what matters now is the economy going forward. Not in the immediate term, but how it's going to be in 5 or 10 years. We've established in this programme that the government's apparently saying a 0.3% uplift in 2040, OK? In the meantime, through dynamic alignment, it will make it, despite what Stella may say, more difficult to conclude free trade agreements.
Although so far, you would admit they've got free trade deals.
It will also choke off. It may
hang on.
actually imperil some of those deals, depending on where the
deals
rules
that are
go.
Deals that are not
hold on,
worth
but
as
it may
much,
do.
though,
But I think we have to have our eyes open to this and not just shut it down as if it doesn't exist. And the final thing, of course, it will restrict us in doing things, say in our agricultural sector, which may be about innovation and making food cheaper and doing things in a better way, that we will not be able to do because we don't have control over those rules and regulations. So I think there are definite restrictions and trade-offs there, and I think we have to be honest.
Well, let's talk about the youth mobility scheme. Hang on, Stella.
But it comes
really
back
simple, Mel.
to what we agreed when we left the EU, which was that we were not going to be part of customs union, single market.
No one voted on that.
And but these things are moving into that space.
People voted to leave the EU politically.
All right, but
leaving the single market and customs union was not on the ballot.
Let's talk about the youth mobility scheme, Stella, because you wanted to raise...
Well, hang on. I want British farmers and British businesses businesses to be able to sell into Europe.
Well, we're
Because
going
the
to
choice
talk to
between
someone from
chlorinated
the-
chicken and an increase of trade in our local markets, which is, as I say, 41% of all our exports go to the EU. I know which wins for British businesses. I know which wins for British farmers.
All right.
I know which wins for the British
Well, we're
public
going to
every
talk to
time.
someone from the fishing industry in a moment about whether they welcome this deal or not. The Youth Mobility Scheme, and whether or not it is a form of free movement, even if they don't call it the Youth Mobility Scheme. Why isn't it, in your mind, free movement?
I mean, I think this is hysterical because I haven't yet heard Mel demand that we end freedom of movement to Australia, to New Zealand, to Canada, to Japan,
Because
to
they've got
Uruguay,
schemes like-
where we've got youth mobility schemes. What's being agreed today is that we will talk about what the remit of a youth mobility scheme would be, including the number of people who would be able to come. But it's very clearly not freedom of movement because it's time limited, it's curtailed. It means that you can't claim benefits, you can't bring anybody with you. We've got models for how it works with other countries. And unless you're going to tell me that you're going to start campaigning for no more Australians to come here, no more New Zealanders to
All
come
right, well,
here,
let Mel-
there's a gross hypocrisy
Mel?
in trying to define it as freedom of movement.
So the devil is in the detail. If it is a highly restricted arrangement that is capped and we have that level of control and there is no
Yeah,
recourse
I'm going to
benefit.
interrupt you just now because, in terms of movement, they've arrived. We're just waiting, hopefully, for the microphones to go live. Well, while we wait, that is Antonio Costa. You can see there, and he
Morning.
has. Ah, here we are.
Dear Prime Minister, dear Keir, dear Ursula, dear Ministers, dear High Representative, dear Maros, let me begin by thanking Prime Minister Keir Starmer for hosting us here in London for what has been a timely and truly productive summit. A few months ago, Prime Minister, you spoke of your ambition to reset the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Today, I'm proud to say we together have delivered on that ambition. You succeeded, we all succeeded. The agreements we have reached today mark not just progress, but a new chapter in the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union, the start of a renewed and strengthened strategic partnership. Over the past months, we have worked tirelessly to rebuild trust. As we discussed during my visit to Downing Street in December, in an increasingly volatile world, deeper collaboration between like-minded partners, natural allies like us, is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Then back in February, I invited you to join the European Union 27 leaders at a retreat in Brussels to discuss defense matters. There, I felt a new positive energy in our relationship. I saw the great potential of what we can accomplish together to make real, tangible progress for the people of the European Union and the United Kingdom. Since then, we have worked hand in hand to support Ukraine, to increase pressure on Russia, to stabilize and strengthen the transatlantic partnership, and to uphold international law and defending the United Nations Charter amid growing security threats. We have been proud of the fruits of that collective effort. A joint statement on cooperation on global issues, a security on defense partnership, and a common understanding and a renewed agenda for cooperation. These agreements represent more than just words on paper. They are a reflection of our shared commitments to security, to prosperity, to development, and to the people we serve on both sides of the channel. Our relationship is grounded in shared values, mutual interests, and the simple fact of our geographical closeness. We are neighbors, allies, partners, and we are friends. Times are changing. The rules-based international order is under attack. Multilateralism is being tested, and the European Union and the United Kingdom are providers of global stability. We must be guardians of the rules-based global order. Europe faces gravest security threat in decades, provoked by Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. But both the United Kingdom and the European Union are united in one belief. We share a fundamental responsibility for the security of Europe. That is why we are committed to continue our efforts together to achieve a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine. A peace that guarantees Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. The ball is now in Russia's court. Together, we will intensify pressure on President Putin, including through a new package of sanctions, to bring him to the negotiation table. Russia must agree to an unconditional ceasefire. It must stop being a threat to Ukraine and to European security. On defense, our new partnership will bring deeper cooperation. It will strengthen Europe's contribution to NATO, and it will sharpen our focus on common strategic priorities. On trade, we are united in our commitment to economic stability. We both believe in free trade, fair, sustainable, and open, as the engine of prosperity for our citizens and for the global economy. On migration, we will work together to reduce irregular flows and to strengthen cooperation with countries of origin and transit. And finally, today, we also address the situation in the Middle East. In particular, we addressed the tragic humanitarian crisis in Gaza, a tragedy where international law is being systematically violated and an entire population is subjected to disproportionate military force. There must be safe, swift, and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid. The remaining hostage must be unconditionally released, and the permanent ceasefire must be reached now. Our discussion reaffirmed our shared conviction that lasting peace and security in the Middle East can only be achieved through the implementation of the two-state solution. Prime Minister Keir, your leadership has been instrumental in turning ambition into action. Today's agreements are a testament to your determination and to the new tone you have brought to our relationship. The United Kingdom and the European Union are stronger when we stand together for prosperity, for security, and for peace in Europe and beyond. This is the message that underpins our renewed cooperation. This is the direction we are taking together after this successful summit, which will be just the first of many, because, as we have agreed today, from now on, the European Union and the United Kingdom will meet every year. So, we see you last week in Brussels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Antonio. Thank you for your words. But my dear,
so you heard the opening remarks there from Antonio Costa, who is President of the European Council, representing member states, and now the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, is speaking. We'll leave the press conference just for a moment until the Prime Minister Keir Starmer makes his remarks. But Mel, just an opening reaction from what you heard there. Times are changing. We're neighbours, partners, and friends. He talked about Ukraine. Has this reset, has this closer relationship been forged out of necessity in terms of defence and the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think a lot of it has been driven by where Trump is on European security. The growing threat from Russia has driven a pressing need now for Europe to get together and to do more. And that means spending more on defence. It means cooperating at a level that they haven't in the past. So I think all of that mood music is very good, and I welcome that. And I think that what we now need to see the UK doing is taking a leading role in Europe as part of that process. What slightly troubles me, and we don't know the full detail of what the access arrangements are to this armaments fund, for example, and whether we're going to have to pay for the privilege of bidding within it, is that I do think, in terms of the deal there, you know, Europe really, the EU needs us in terms of defence. We're one of the two nuclear powers. We have very important assets. We're very strong when it comes to security and intelligence and so on. And I will be looking at that very closely when this deal is finally fully laid out, as to whether, once again, you know, this government has played a rather weak hand and not got, you know, a good deal in that respect, or whether they've really driven a sensible bargain that's
let's get some more reaction. We're going to speak to Mike Cohen in a moment, who is from the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations. But first, on this issue of whether or not it is the fishing industry that has had to be compromised in this deal, let's hear from the leader of the Conservatives, Kemi Badenoch.
I am gobsmacked that Keir Starmer has signed this deal. This is a sellout, certainly on fishing. I cannot believe that instead of getting better terms on fishing, we've got worse terms. I was worried that he was going to come back with 3 years for the next negotiation. It's 12 years. It's going to be over a decade that we are giving away our fishing rights. That sells out so many coastal communities in the UK. And compared to what the Faroe Islands get, they get an annual negotiation on fish. I cannot believe that Keir Starmer has given that away.
That was Kemi Badenoch. Let's talk to Mike Cohen. He joins us from North Yorkshire. As I say, he represents the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations. Hello to you. What do you make of the deal?
We're hugely disappointed in the deal that's been done here. As was just pointed out, the EU and the UK have annual access deals with the Faroes, with Iceland, with Norway. This is not an unusual way to work. We've just given away the biggest card we had, the best card in our hand in the annual negotiations over fishing rights, over quotas and allowable catches with Europe, in return for no benefit to UK fishing at all. Our waters are hugely valuable to the EU. Some of its fleets are totally dependent on being able to fish UK waters. And we failed to make any use of that to benefit British fishing.
Stella, do you want to respond? And if you...
I mean, and I listen to what Mike's saying. I don't see that, mainly because I think the previous government promised fishermen that somehow there would be restrictions on access. In fact, it was the worst of all worlds, where they gave away access to the seas, and then they didn't do anything about the paperwork and the increase in cost and exporting. And of course, we know that 80% of the British take is actually exported, 70% to the EU. So I do think there is a better prospect for British fishers in two ways. One, in terms of certainty about what the deal is and what the access arrangements are. There's no change in access arrangements. But two, in terms of reducing and indeed eliminating that paperwork that meant that the market for British fish has dropped by a third.
All right, well,
so I do think we will see some benefits coming forward as a direct result of this deal.
Mike?
The access arrangements that we had before that the Johnson government rolled over were deeply inequitable, and we were extremely disappointed that they were rolled over. What we've seen here is, I mean, certainty. We have the certainty that we still have a terrible deal on access to our waters for the EU fleet. When it comes to exports, that isn't going to benefit fishermen. The big retailers have been very positive, and exporters and fish farmers will benefit from it. But exporters and hauliers who have a cheaper route to take things to the European market will benefit. They won't be passing that on to the producers who make the raw materials. European consumers will presumably benefit from the importers in Europe getting a better deal on that trade process. It isn't going to help British fishermen. And it's a good deal for Europe too.
All right, well, let's bring in Mel Stride, here from the Conservative Party, Shadow Chancellor. Mike says it was a pretty bad deal that you negotiated, and it's going to stay that way.
Well, we are where we are now, and what matters is this a good deal?
You take no responsibility for that.
We can't keep going back to ever into the past, which I know there's a tendency that people have to do. Look, is this a good deal? Absolutely not. This government was trying to hold out for a 4-year deal because they recognised that they didn't want to get locked in. One of the things it will do is it has now taken the leverage that we have had with the EU around fish off the table for over a decade. That is a very weak position to be in. Why has it happened? Because this government has mucked up the economy. It has destroyed growth. It is scrabbled around trying to get deals with India and with America, which, for the reasons I explained earlier, I think are flawed. And now it's rushing into something that is to the deep detriment of our fishermen, but equally will be to the deep detriment of future negotiations.
You did negotiate that deal at the time. The leverage that you're talking about was there potentially at the time that you negotiated the original deal. I mean, the fishing industry is, of course, hugely important for the people who work in it, but it is still a very small part of the economy, isn't it?
It's a very, very important part of the economy, particularly coastal communities. But we also negotiated getting out of the single market, getting out of the customs union, the ability to do our trade deals around the world, no longer sending money to the EU. A lot of that is being unpicked. What we're
let me just come back to Mike. Let me just get a final word from Mike, responding to what you've just heard from Mel Stride there, who doesn't want to look back in the past to the original deal. Is that what you're doing or have been doing?
There's no benefit in looking back to the original deal. We need to focus on where we are, or where we were this morning before we learned that deal has got worse. This isn't just going to impact the fishing sector either. This impacts anything that we're going to do in the sea, whether that's conservation areas or licensing for offshore construction for offshore wind. We've given the EU a huge tool to use to restrict our ability to do things. They have access to that trade dispute mechanism that they used when we tried a conservation measure for sand eel. They can do this to a greater extent now. So I think the ramifications of this will be felt for quite some time to come.
Sonia?
Trade deals are about compromises on all sides. And the reason why the past is important and what Boris Johnson negotiated is important because it shows what's possible. Because that Conservative government was trying to get the best for the UK too. This government is trying to get the best for the UK. The unfortunate thing about trade deals is they always create some winners and some losers. And the thing that you want for your economy is you want the wins to be bigger than the losers. I think it's significant, the fact that there are some in the fish industry, as Vicky Young referenced, those in Scottish salmon farming, for example, who think that this deal is a good thing. And that is just the unfortunate reality. There are trade-offs in trade deals.
Do you accept that?
But if you add in a restriction of 12 years, no one has a clue what's going to change in those 12 years. But the one thing we do know is basically since 73, a lot of farmers have felt like, fishermen have felt like they have been at a massive disadvantage as a result of the levels of access that European vessels have had to UK waters. There is no sign that that dynamic is fundamentally going to change.
Let's just dip back into this press conference because the Prime Minister has started addressing the assembled press.
More leadership on this as well. Ladies and gentlemen, Britain is back on the world stage, working with our partners, doing deals that will grow our economy and putting more money in the pockets of working people. In the last 2 weeks alone, we've delivered trade deals with India and the US. And that means jobs saved, jobs created, more growth, and a huge vote of confidence in this country. It shows that as global instability is rising, the decisions that we've taken to stabilise the economy and lead the way internationally have made Britain a place where people want to do business once again. And from that position of strength, today we have struck this landmark deal with the EU, a new partnership between an independent Britain and our allies in Europe. This is the first UK-EU summit. It marks a new era in our relationship. And this deal is a win-win. It delivers what the British public voted for last year. It gives us unprecedented access to the EU market, the best of any country outside of the EU or EFTA, all while sticking to the red lines in our manifesto about not rejoining the single market, the customs union, and no return to freedom of movement. So this deal is good for both sides. And let me set out why it is good for Britain. We've struck an SPS deal to make food and agricultural trade with the EU cheaper and easier. And that is slashing red tape and bureaucracy. And that means lower food prices at checkouts, more choice in our supermarkets, and of course more money in people's pockets. It will boost British exporters because once again, after a long absence, we'll be able to sell Great British burgers, shellfish, and other products into the EU. We've also struck a new defence and security partnership to strengthen our cooperation and strengthen our security, which is vital in this dangerous new era. And it will open the door.
We'll
to
leave the
working
Prime
with
Minister there as he
EU's new
talks
defence
about what's in the deal. He
providing
said
more
that the UK will have unprecedented access to the EU. In your heart of hearts, Stella, would you have liked this to have gone further? More access?
This is the start of a process. I would like to see things like the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention on the table, which is about the rules of origin, which is another source of all the big paperwork. And then I think, yes, plus that an SPS deal for British food, for British manufacturing. It makes a real difference. But this is the start of something good, and I think we should welcome it as that.
Mel, Strive, what do you make of what you heard from the Prime Minister? Are you convinced?
No, I just think that when it comes to Labour negotiating, it's the country that loses. I'm afraid we've seen it with Chagos, where we're giving back that territory and paying for the privilege of doing so. We saw the American deal, where we're now paying more tariffs to the Americans than before Trump, and they're paying less.
We're not.
We are, actually. No, we are.
All right, hang on, because we're almost out of time.
US
That's
tariffs
it.
coming into this country
All right.
by 2/3 as a result of
It's
the
all
Labour
we have
Party
time
deal.
for today. I'll be back at 12:15 tomorrow. My guests will include Reform UK's Lee Anderson. Do join me then. You can continue watching the Prime Minister on the BBC News Channel. Bye-bye.